And as I mentioned earlier in the day, we are going from very micro to very macro. And one of the speakers on this panel remarked that, wow, this one's going to be really different from the other ones. But again, keeping with our thread of this conference that we're taking snapshot looks at these issues, this is our international snapshot. So we've already heard a bit, and I like when the threads connect. We've already heard a bit this morning and this afternoon about the impacts of what's going on in the Arctic. This panel is going to look at the Arctic specifically in depth from a number of points of view. So let me quickly introduce our moderator and panelists, and we'll get going. Our moderator is my colleague, Professor Michael Berger. He's an associate professor here at Roger Williams University School of Law. He also had some of his students come to the conference, so thank you for that. We appreciate that. And most importantly, he's on my advisory board and was a tremendous help in helping pull this conference together. So in the order that they're sitting up there, in the order that we're going to go through, again, we're going to start with some scientific context, and I can't think of anyone better to provide scientific context for the Arctic than Larry Mayer. Larry has a blow your mind away bio, so please take a look at it in your program and read it, but let me just highlight a couple of things. He's currently a professor and the director of the Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping at the University of New Hampshire. He did get his honors degree in geology from, where? The University of Rhode Island. They all come back. He's been at sea a lot. He's done all kinds of stuff. He was selected as an astronaut candidate. Just a phenomenal background. But the reason he's here today is because of his current research focus dealing with sonar imaging and remote characterization of the floor as it relates to mapping law of the sea issues, particularly in the Arctic. Just a side note, in putting this program together, I arranged panel calls with all the members of the panel so that we could all talk about their presentations before they get here. And this one was by far the most challenging because we had Larry up in the Arctic with limited email access. We had Kirsten in Norway with just a little time difference. And Betsy on detail down in DC. So it was challenging to pull it together, but that's why we have such great people presenting. Dr. Mayer is going to talk about the U.S. mapping efforts in support of establishing an extended continental shelf under the Law of the Sea, Article 76. Following him, we're going to hear from Kirsten, and I'm going to butcher your name, Ullbaek Selvig. All right. Thank you. My mom's German, maybe that helps a bit. And since 1996, she's been the Director General in the Norwegian Ministry of Fisheries and Coastal Affairs with responsibility for infrastructure for maritime transport, ports, port security, oil spill preparation, civil radio navigation policy, and the National and Coastal Administration. And she's going to talk about transport corridors and maritime infrastructure in the Arctic from the Norwegian perspective. Next, we're going to hear from Walter Berbrick. Walter is an assistant professor at the Center for Naval Warfare Studies at the U.S. Naval War College across a couple of bridges down in Newport. And he's going to talk about U.S. security implications of what's happening in the Arctic right now. Finally, we're going to close out with Betsy Baker. Betsy is an associate professor at Vermont Law School and a senior fellow for Oceans and Energy at Vermont Law's Institute for Energy and the Environment. She's currently on a detail as a visiting scholar with the U.S. Extended Continental Shelf Task Force in Washington, D.C., and she's going to talk about resource development in the Arctic Ocean, the legal and institutional infrastructure that she's examining. So I'll turn it over to the panel. Excellent. All right, and your clicker's right there. Forward, back, late, point.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I couldn't think of a better introduction for my talk than Bill Curry's fantastic keynote this morning, because he really wonderfully demonstrated that there's no place that climate change is manifesting itself more dramatically than in the Arctic. And within the context of maritime law, these changes have had really critical impact on our ability to establish our sovereign rights over the resources of the seabed. And when we talk about sovereign rights over the resources of the seabed, what we're really talking about is the Law of the Sea Treaty, and particularly Article 76. And it's quite interesting that we hadn't coordinated this, but I start with the same contrast, although I'm using somewhat different years. I'm a little older than Bill. So I go 2000 to 2007 in terms of showing the contrast. There's dramatic changes that have been taking place in the Arctic. And so again, when we talk about sovereign rights of resources, we're talking about Article 76 of the Law of the Sea Treaty, just 617 little words that really redefine the continental shelf. I always talk about the audacity of the lawyers to come along and redefine the meaning of continental shelf. We geologists know exactly what the continental shelf is in terms of that flat part near the coast, but the lawyers have redefined it and provided a mechanism for a coastal state to extend its sovereign rights over the resources of the seafloor and the subsoil of that extended continental shelf. We tend to call it the extended continental shelf, although I think Betsy will say nowhere in the treaty is that term used, extended continental shelf. The way this is done is by demonstrating that your continental margin has certain morphological characteristics. Characteristics about the depth of the margin and the shape of the margin, in particular, something called the foot of the slope, defined as the maximum change in gradient at the base. The 2,500 meter depth contour, that's a line of 2,500 meter depth. The thickness of the sediment on the continental margin, and the distances from the territorial sea baselines, in particular 350 nautical miles. And it's very, very complicated, and it's a wonderful nexus of law and science. It's really, again, those 617 words mix all kinds of ambiguous legal concepts with ambiguous geologic concepts, and it kind of gives you this ultimate of ambiguity, which will keep lawyers working, I suspect, forever, and a few geologists and geophysicists like me. But the bottom line, and that's why I'm involved, is that to do this, you have to map the seafloor. And I'm going to show you very quickly, and don't get worried if you don't understand what you're seeing, just how this works. The writers of the treaty had a very early idea, a kind of 1970s idea of what the continental margin looked like, a very naive idea. It's much more complex than this. But they basically said if we take a look at the geologic continental shelf, and if you have what every coastal state is entitled to, a 200 nautical mile EEZ, if your shelf extended beyond that, actually if the continental margin extends beyond that, and I don't want to get into the subtle differences, you can extend your shelf in two ways, two formula lines. You can find the foot of the slope, that point where the change in slope has a maximum gradient, and go 60 miles beyond that, or, and it's an and/or, so you can combine these to whichever is to your advantage. You can look at the thickness of the sediment. There's sediment underlying the shelf, and this is all about oil and gas resources. That's why they did it. And find that point where the thickness of sediment is 1% of the distance back to that foot of the slope. And then, as I said, you can combine these and take whichever is to your advantage. But it gets more complicated because there's a limit to how far you can go. That's defining what they call the continental margin. To define the continental slope, you then apply two limit lines, and those lines are a line that is 100 nautical miles beyond the 2,500 meter depth contour and or 350 nautical miles from the territorial sea baseline here. And again, you can combine all those, find out which is to your advantage, put them all together, and come out with an extended continental shelf. Very, very simple. But the bottom line is you got to go out and map, and that's why we're involved. We're the National Center for Excellence in Seafloor Mapping up at the University of New Hampshire. And so since 2003, we've been going about, despite the fact that the U.S. hasn't acceded to the treaty, we're acting as if we will. We're under directions as if we will. We're going to continue to act as if we will. And we've been mapping everywhere where the U.S. has a potential extended continental shelf, including, as you can see here, 8 cruises to the Arctic. And why that focus on the Arctic? Well, the Arctic is quite different than the other oceans. The Arctic has about 52% of its area is geologic continental shelf. These broad, wide areas are all geologic continental shelf. The closest competitor is about 17% in the Atlantic. So if you start off with 52% of the ocean as geologic continental shelf, a lot more of it is going to be extended continental shelf. So there's a tremendous amount of extended continental shelf in the Arctic. In reality, almost all of it. There's going to be very little left after each of the nations determine their extended continental shelves. Also, I think you're all well aware that the USGS and many others have recognized that a lot of the remaining hydrocarbon reserves are in the Arctic. 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% undiscovered gas, 20% undiscovered natural gas liquids. So there's a tremendous resource potential in the Arctic. But there's an issue. If you got to go map there, we know the ice is diminishing, but believe me, there's still ice there. How do you map in that? And that's been a problem. And here's a map from 1906. A lot of young people here. To me, 1906 is long ago, but not that long ago. That in 1906, there was not a single deep measurement in the Arctic Ocean. The maps just said unknown regions. And it took Nansen and his phenomenal drift across the Arctic, which went from 1893 to 1896, and he finally published a map in 1907 where he had 7 depth measurements. You can see them here, these little dots, and magically, I don't know how, he took those 7 depth measurements and determined that there was a deep ocean out there. Because many of the models before showed Greenland extending. The Danes would have loved that. They had land extending all the way up here and things like that. But this was the first indication that there was a deep ocean in the Arctic. Now, between that and about 1940, the way Nansen made those measurements is what was called a lead line, except in the ice they couldn't heave the lead line and measure 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 meters. They had to break a hole through the ice and lower it. Very, very tedious, slow process. So between 1906 and 1940 or so, there were only about 2,000 individual measurements made through the ice to determine the depths in the ocean. So you can imagine something the size of the Arctic Ocean, easily more than the size of New England, with 2,000 measurements on it, and that's it. You really don't have much of an idea what it looks like. Around the time of the Second World War, people developed techniques to measure the depth of the seafloor much more quickly than throwing a hunk of lead at the end of a rope. Something called an echo sounder, a single beam echo sounder, put out a big cone of sound onto the seafloor. It bounces back and you time it. Well, again, the problem is how do you get there in the ice? And so they brought these echo sounders out, but they'd bring them out individually and cut a hole in the ice or put it on top of the ice and make just point measurements. So very, very slow, very, very tedious process, not many measurements made. More recently, in the last 20 or 30 years or so, there's been a very new innovation in terms of how we map the seafloor. Instead of just one measurement with a big cone of sound, we have now what we call multi-beam echo sounders. And these have like lots of little laser beams of sound that map a big swath of the seafloor all at once, very, very accurately, across a wide swath, sometimes 3-4 times the water depth. So you can do 12 kilometers at a time with hundreds of measurements in between. Well, again, how do you do that in the ice? Well, with multi-beam echo sounders, it was worth trying to put them on an icebreaker. And so what we've seen over the last few years is a fleet of icebreakers led really by originally the Germans, but never deep into the Arctic. But then the US with the icebreaker Healy, each one equipped with one of these multi-beam echo sounders. And this is what has enabled us to map in the Arctic. But, and this is what comes back right to Bill's talk, none of this would have been possible if it hadn't been for the changes we've seen in the Arctic over the last 15 or 20 years. Even with these icebreakers, we could not have gotten into most of the Arctic to do the mapping. And it comes back to the picture that Bill sent of this minimum extent of ice in September. And here's now September, which is always the minimum ice month, from 1979, when the first satellite observations were made, to this 2011. And we see that on average, there's a decline of about 12% in that extent of the ice per decade. It doesn't take long to extrapolate that down, as Bill said, to nothing. And so I'm going to talk now about our mapping activities, but always in the context of this diminishing ice curve, because this is really what's allowed us the access. Bill also mentioned that it's not just the extent of ice, and particularly when you're trying to get into the ice and break the ice, these icebreakers can do pretty well in first-year ice. Every year, every winter, the ice is going to grow. It depends on how much accumulates from year to year. And Bill said on the average, the ice used to be about six years old. Well, it's that thick ice that prevents the icebreaker, what we call the multi-year ice, 2, 3, 4-year ice that can be 10 meters thick, that forms ridges. And even the Russian nuclear icebreakers can't get through that. And what we've seen over the years is a phenomenal diminishing, right in line with the diminishment of the ice extent of the ice thickness. Between 1980 and 2000, about 30% of the ice was more than 2 years old. 2009, 10% of the ice, only 10% of the ice was more than 2 years old. And in the last few years, even less. So that thick ice, the permanent ice pack is really diminishing very, very quickly. This has all kinds of ramifications, and I think we'll hear from Kirsten about this. This, of course, having minimum ice allows passages through the Northwest Passage or the Northern Sea Route, or even people talking about over the top of the Arctic, which saves a tremendous amount in shipping from Europe to Asia, and we'll hear more about that. Bill talked about the changes in temperature and how the Arctic, again, is the most sensitive, and we're seeing already very measurable changes in seawater temperature, sea surface temperature, bottom water temperatures, and with that, the migration of fish. Although that has not been well documented, it's been predicted. And this is a very good example of the precautionary principle. The Arctic Management Area has put a closure to fisheries just because of the great concern of the migration of the pollock stock up into that region. And they want to be able to control it until they understand what's happening. There's also a phenomenal geopolitical issue, and that has a lot to do with the shape of the Arctic. We have 5 Arctic coastal states, all facing each other, all with extended continental shelves, all with potential for extending their claim. One group's view of what these claims are, there's only 2 resolved boundaries in the Arctic. The US and Russia actually have a resolved boundary, and Norway and Russia recently, because of the Law of the Sea Treaty, negotiated a boundary so that they can exploit resources there. Our focus, as I said, these 8 cruises has been in the Chukchi area. This was clearly a large extension of the US margin. When we first looked at it, the data we had in 2003, it looked like we would be able to extend the continental margin. Here's the EEZ here, 200 nautical miles, but that would be the extended margin. That's quite an extension, about twice the size of California. Fortunately, we have an icebreaker, the Healy, with one of these multi-beam systems, but we didn't know if you can break ice and use a system like this at the same time. You're listening for a quiet echo with a sonar, and breaking ice is a very noisy experience. So I just want to give you in the context, 2003, not an extraordinary year, just a regular diminishment. This was our test. Will it work? We had just a 10-day trip out from Barrow up to the Russian boundary, trying to follow the 2,500 meter contour. We found it was quite easy to do. It was all first-year ice, what they call cheesy ice. Ship can go through it easily. We were able to map. We found that the existing maps we had, based on those lead line soundings, were totally wrong. Here's where the 2,500 meter contour really was. Here's where it thought it was. It has a huge difference in terms of the Law of the Sea extension. We discovered seamounts, 3,000 meters high, that submarines had crossed over without knowing about. So, and there are lots of those out there. We discover them all the time. We went back the next year because this worked. We said, oh, now we can start looking for the foot of the slope, finishing up what we're doing. 2004 was no different than 2003. Very, very close in terms of the minimum ice extent. But when we got up there, we were locked in solid. We actually got stuck. 18 hours, we couldn't get anywhere, backing and ramming, and finally had to give up. And so this is, again, we have to be careful when we say we're going to have an ice-free Arctic. There's always going to be ice up there somewhere. And if you happen to be in that spot where the ice is and the wind is blowing at you and compressing the ice, you're always going to need an icebreaker. It'll be not in our lifetimes that we won't need icebreakers to work in the Arctic. So we had to retreat and map off the Barrow margin, where we eventually have to map to, because we have a foot of the slope off there. I'm going to jump to 2007, which was the previous ice minimum, and this was remarkable, because this was palpable, the differences in the ice. That's now thick multi-year ice, but broken up into little pieces. And it really was very, I always say, it's very good for mapping, very, very bad for the Arctic, because it doesn't heal. That's the, you can't in a year put it back together. It takes hundreds of years to put it back together. But what that allowed us to do is head way far north, much further than we were planning, much further than we thought the foot of the slope was. We thought the foot of the slope was over here from the pre-existing maps, and by being able to go very far, we found that the foot of the slope was way down here. Radically changed by several hundred miles our view of where the foot of the slope is and where our extended continental shelf will be. And we have a very, very strong argument for the foot of the slope. That's the abyssal plain, the deep sea, that's the continental margin. And so we thought it was there, and it comes around to here. From that time, 2007 till 2011, we worked together with the Canadians, despite the fact that we're going to have a huge overlap with them. and I just bounce through those years, just tell you we worked together and come back to 2011. We focused mostly on the deep basin, where we collected another type of data that looks at the sediment thickness. And just to give you an example of that, we ran a line here and all through the Canada Basin to measure how thick the sediment is. And this is what one of these seismic lines look like. We now see the thickness of the sediment and get an idea for the geologic history of it too. Again, something we could have never done years before. So the situation last year was this. We had originally thought the foot of the slope was there. We now know it goes at least there. We had some question about where it went over there, and then it continues on over on this feature called the Mendeleev Ridge. So there's, again, potential for tremendous extension. This last year, we went back again, now focusing on that unknown area, and this year was amazing. It was much, much less even than 2007. And we had been, through all our cruises, in the same place at the same time, roughly. So here we are at 80 degrees north. Every previous year, we would run into the ice at about 75, 76 north. So this is 2007, the previous ice minimum, 80 north, and 80 north on September 6th. And here it is this year, same position, September 12th, 6 days later. There's the ice. You can just see the ice margin way beyond 80 north. It was frightening. It truly is frightening. As I say, you know, we're not going to not need icebreakers, but take any climate denier and put him on an iceberg up there right now, and let's see how long he denies that things are changing. So what that let us do is map like we would normally. We got tremendous amount of mapping because we were in open water. It also makes you seasick, which is interesting, because normally there's never any motion on the ice, so it's quite fun. But we also were able to sample. We can send a primitive thing we call a dredge, just a rock, a steel bag down, and start dredging stuff. And now, so we're starting to understand what the material is made of, including, and this has not been reported before, corals up at 79 north. So very, very interesting. And so over those years, we've done an amazing amount of mapping, about 389,000 square kilometers. It's really changed our view of what our extended continental shelf is. It's been made possible because of the changes in climate. That's good and bad. But I said good for mapping, bad for the Arctic. But I don't want you to get the idea that that's all there is. We take all of the data we collect, we contribute it to an ongoing project to look at a global synthesis, thing called IPCAL. And I just wanted to point out one other thing, because I think we're going to be hearing a lot about cooperation or lack thereof and what's really needed in the Arctic. The unfortunate thing is all this data is the data that's been contributed to our international map of the Arctic. The red is the Healy, but you notice it's blank on the other side of the Arctic. And we're having real difficulties with one of our Arctic neighbors in terms of making contributions. And maybe, Walter, you'll touch on that, or Betsy, I don't know. If any of you have any influence. They're out there mapping, they're just not sharing. And so again, we've done a lot, but I just have to remind you that only 11% of the Arctic has been mapped. There's still much, much more to discover and learn, which affects all of us. Thank you.
So, forward to advance slides.
Can I use this one?
You can if you want, and if you want the pointer, that's that right
but
there.
I can use this too.
And that's your timer, and the lights will flash on there when you get 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you for this invitation. And firstly, I would like to thank Susan and the University Roger Williams and the Law School for setting this very important agenda. So thank you very much for that. Now my task here today is to talk a little bit about transport corridors and the maritime infrastructure in the Arctic and the Norwegian approach. And I have set up some key issues for my presentation. What is the situation in the Arctic when it comes to maritime activities? What can we expect and players and activities? What can we do? And what are we doing on international, regional, bilateral, and domestic level? And for us here today, also, what will be the legal framework for what we are doing? And another very important issue is also, what is the budget? What is the funding? Because every measure you take will have need for some financial support. So that will be another issue. I will not go that much into details because everybody knows about budget procedures, so let's keep it out for today. Another question is also, when do we need it and when can it be established? We have heard a lot about the global interest for the Arctic. Why? That's fisheries, oil and gas, new transport routes, and other natural resources. That's very well known. Fisheries, oil and gas, and new transport routes, and maritime shipping, that's very familiar to us. We have a lot of experience in Norway when it comes to that three activities, also in the Arctic areas. When it comes to other natural resources, that is not that common. And I think that's an area where we need more discussion, analysis, and also maybe frameworks. And we know that when the ice is melting, for example, Greenland, that will be more open for new activities where mineral resources will be of great importance. So, who are the players? The 5 polar nations, we have heard about them already: USA, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and Russia. The Arctic Council nations, that's the 5, plus 3 other very important Arctic nations. And I will not go further into that because Betsy will address the Arctic Council in her presentation. I will also draw your attention to the Far East nations. China, South Korea, and Japan, they are very eager to take part in these new opportunities in the high north. For example, South Korea, they have their own institute for the Northern Sea route. I'll come back to that. I would also like to draw your attention to the European Union, because that's a regional, and from your part of the world, it's maybe not the most focusing union, but it's very important because they do a lot of legislation and they have a focus on what is going on in the Arctic. So please be aware of that. And let me also stress the legal platform, that's UNCLOS. I stress it, it can't be stressed enough, it's so important, even we are lawyers or legal forum today. One thing with the UNCLOS, and I hope you will come back to that, is that the 4 of the 5 nations, they are partners. We are missing one. Okay. I hope that will be fixed one day. Here's a little bit about Norway. You see, we have a lot of activities when it comes to oil and gas, fisheries, aquaculture. We have a lot of old experience, historical experience from that. We have maritime transport as well. We have 5 million people in Norway. Also, we had a dispute with Russia for around 40 years, but it was settled 2 years ago, and that was really a good thing for both the 2 nations, but also for all the countries in the Arctic area, because the less disputes we have, the better it is for the whole society around the poles and in the Arctic. So that's a very important platform be established that time. I have another little map here. You see Norway, we are somewhere. Here we are. Yes, and America is around here. But what I would like to show you with this map, that is that here you have the, let me call it, European entrance, gateway to the Arctic. If you are here, you have the Far East entrance, and that's Russia and America here. And then you have South Korea, Japan, and China as the other neighbors, just to keep that in mind. But every time we are talking about the Arctic, everybody says, oh, that's a new ocean. But that's not a new ocean, not for the people living close to this area. We already have a significant amount of traffic in our adjacent waters. It's not transit shipping, but it's domestic, and that's so important for what we are doing. Here, where are we? Here. in our northern part of Norway, all our activities are related. The same here in the northern part of Russia. We have Murmansk here, and they have a lot of minerals and goods they have to export this way out here. When we are talking about law and legal framework, we have here we are, Svalbard area, and we have now implemented the mainland Norwegian law framework for these islands because of safety. And it also means, for example, that we have introduced a mandatory pilot service that will be implemented within 2 years for all cruising. And that's very important to have that sort of safety legal framework when it comes to the Arctic. So we are a coastal nation in Norway. We are also a flag state, a shipping nation. But when we are with the head of the coastal nation, we have to ask ourselves, what can we expect of increased activities in this area? We can expect more cruise ships, fisheries, of course, special transport. With that, I mean, if you want to have other activities in addition to shipping, for example, mineral exploitation and production, oil and gas, you need to have your platforms, your equipment transported to this site, to these areas. So whatever you do, you have to go and use the sea. And container ships, yeah, maybe tankers, of course, and others. That's, with that I mean military defense. And where will they go? We have to ask us that question. Now I will jump to, not this one, this one. You have some possibilities, not that many for the time being. The red one, that's a northern sea route. That's the one which is going, as you can see, along the Russian coastline within the Russian territorial waters. And it's very important because they will then have the rights according to being a coastal nation. It also means that it's a shallow waters, so they have to transfer the goods from ship to ship when you are out of this area. Otherwise, there will be not economical supporting for that sort of shipping. But what we can see with the ice retreating, that's maybe it will move here, or maybe also a transpolar routing. You are rather familiar with the yellow one because that's along your coastline and the Canadian coastline. But when it comes to here, maybe it will go this way. We never know. So we have to, for example, if you were China, you could go this way and down here. That's shorter. We are talking about money. We are talking about savings. When you are a commercial industry, you would like to have a shorter distance to your markets. So when people are asking me, what can we expect? Will we see an alternative to the Suez or the Panama? I'm not sure, because I can't foresee that we will have 10,000, 20,000 transports in this area. I suppose that will be more dedicated transport. That will be dedicated to the activities in the area, exploring oil and gas and transporting it to the markets. And I also foresee that there will be a lot of researching in these areas because it's so rich in resources. And one thing more, when we are talking about the commercial aspect, that's the insurance. Nobody will send their cargo or their ship without an appropriate insurance. And we can just ask some of the insurance people here in this audience today, that, and also other legal people here, that it's not that easy to have it insured in these areas. So that will be very important for the future. This is just to show you what is the possibilities for Russia to have their transport corridors in the European areas. I won't say any more about that. So when I said it's not a new ocean, but of course we can't take it that easy, because we see there will be possible new regional and global opportunities and challenges, both for maritime transport and other activities. And that is important, again, for the coastal states, the flag states, and also the commercial interest. But what do we need if we are looking a little bit into the future? Yes, we need knowledge, research, exchange of experience, and management plan. What is that? That's something we have been doing in Norway for some years when it comes to opening new areas for oil production. Then you need to have a plan which will cover all consequences and impact for the environment, for other activities, and so on. So there will be a full analysis before you can open up for activities. So I think that's a very good tool, and I can recommend it highly to others. And we discussed, for example, with Russia to have an exchange of views on that. That's very important. Another thing I would like to stress, that is that we have to keep in mind that cooperation is so important for doing things well in this area. We shouldn't take care of not doing some competition. It might be difficult because there is different agendas in the different nations, but so far I think that cooperation is really at the top priority, so that's important. And it's also important because we can't manage this area without having a common view on standards, framework. We have to have a seamless system in the area. So still, I think that these discussions going on within IMO and within the Arctic Council, which Betsy will come back to, they are so important. But what else do we need if we are talking more about specific needs in this area when it comes to infrastructure? Yes, we should take preventive measures. Everything you can do before something will happen, an incident or an accident, the better. The more you have saved of everything. You should be prepared if something happens anyway. Oil spill, we have some experience. You have even bigger experience in your country, so I don't need to elaborate on that. And search and rescue, and we are so happy that this Arctic Council has established an agreement on search and rescue. So what really do we need when we are in this area? Yes, we need surveillance. We need communication. People have to talk. The ship has to have a contact with other ships with for rescue purposes, for where they are going, to know their positions, to know, and so on. And for a coastal state, you would like to know where are the ships, and also the ship owners would like to know. Ship owners don't know where their ships are, they know exactly where it is. Data exchange, I could talk a full day about data. There's so many data. We should have the right data, the quality data. So that's an issue by itself, so that's important. Also, I would like to stress that it's not possible to establish lighthouses, buoys, and so on. So everything should be dependent on virtual aids to navigation. And that means that Larry's maps, they will be most needed because you can't make the routing if you don't know exactly where in the map you are. And that will be the only support you will have. And really, the challenges, they are enormous in this area. And I don't like to send any of our people out to make rescue operations. Maybe it's not possible if you are maybe 4 or 5 hours by helicopters away and you should refuel. Oh dear, now I got a red light. So you see, we really have a lot of challenges when it comes to these areas. And I said, and I would like to stress that ordinary navigation aids, they don't is possible in this area. Satellite communications, that is most important. That is a fundamental. You have it in your iPhones, you have it everywhere, the GPS. The global navigation satellite system, GPS, that's the most global system in the world. Number 2, that's Russia, GLONASS. And there's a little discussion whether China or European Union is in number 4. But anyway, the man or the nation who is in charge of these systems, they will be in a very good position when it comes to all sort of controlling infrastructure. We have talked about ice, sea ice, icebergs, and icing on the ships. I love this one, but I can't tell you about it. It's too late. It was an iceberg, because icebergs, they are moving very, very quick for 3 days. So if you are establishing an oil platform, how should you manage that? If you have your shipping, you can make your virtual routing. So you can go into the maps, and with your communication surveillance system, as I mentioned, if you establish that, you can follow the ships in an appropriate way. So, and we need it for all sort of control, what is going on in our backyards, fisheries control, maritime safety, search and rescue, environmental protection, and so on. When it comes to what are we doing and together with whom, there is a global approach, the multilateral cooperation on UNCLOS, again, that's a fundamental. IMO, they are doing the polar code, the e-navigation, the polar code, that's what sort of equipment should be on board the ships when they are moving into the Arctic. And the same is a little bit about the e-navigation. So something is going on, but it takes some time, and in the meantime, and parallel with that, we see new ships being built. So again, for people here with a legal interest in shipbuilding, be aware of what is going on in the shipbuilding industry, because you have to take into account the future needs and requirements. We have had a bilateral cooperation with Russia for many years. Russia is our closest neighbor. We have 170 kilometers onshore, but enormous areas in the sea. So we established a formal cooperation, the Memorandum of Understanding in 2006. And I have had for many years a little steering group with my counterpart in the Ministry of Transport in Russia. And they were very supporting when we discussed transport in these, this is Norway and Russia here, in these areas. And we said that we had problems in Norway with the oil transport very close to our coastline. So we went to IMO with a routing system, 600 nautical miles, 30 nautical miles off the coastline of Norway, and we got that approved, and with support from Russia. And now we have prolonged it along the Norwegian coastline. But again, that's an example, and now we have a common project, Russia and Norway, for IMO, where we are doing a shipping reporting system to support this routing system. And again, Norway and European Union, we do a lot of cooperation as well. And domestic, we have done a lot of with the ISS along the coastline. Ports, I am not talking about ports today. But if you are doing anything in the high north, you need ports as services and for the activities. No, I know. I think you are quite right. And risk, that would be next year's symposium, I suppose. But again, you can just take it with you, and we can discuss later on during the reception and so on, what sort of risk are we ready to take in this area. We are talking a lot, and we are thinking a lot, and I think we are cooperating a lot. That's most important. So share our knowledge here today, everybody, and to continue our good cooperation. That's so important. So thank you for giving this time to talk a little bit. Thank you very much.
Laser pointer, and that's the timer of doom.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, thanks again, Susan, for the invitation, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. My intent over the next few minutes is to walk you through some of the national security level implications that could result as a result of the opening of the Arctic. And we'll look at this through the context of two events that we hosted at the Naval War College in 2010 and 2011, both of which were for the Chief of Naval Operations, the head of the U.S. Navy. At the time was Admiral Ruffhead. Skip that slide. At the time, Admiral Ruffhead was preparing for testimony on Congress, and he asked the Naval War College to develop a game that examined the strategic level implications as a result of future changes in global shipping patterns. And he wanted to also assess the impacts of ratification or non-ratification of UNCLOS. And he wanted to look at this within the context of two scenarios. One was the expansion of the Panama Canal in 2016, and the other one was the opening of the Arctic in 2035. I'll skip that. So there are three primary themes that emerged from this particular event, from this game. And the first of which was projected changes in global shipping patterns would be gradual rather than happening overnight. And the major reason for that was that that the gradual change in these shipping patterns would be pretty much in lockstep with the gradual changes in global climate conditions. Interestingly enough, what we found was that increased global demand and technological advances could accelerate global shipping patterns. And preparing for these changes and these challenges, in many cases, by industry and government, will require long lead times, some more than a decade. And the second theme with respect to Arctic economic viability was that really understanding the extent of economic viability is necessary to determine the extent of those implications that'll impact the U.S. and U.S. maritime forces. And really, the nature of economic viability in the Arctic was more a result of resource extraction, thus the increased amount of destinational shipping, so to and from the Arctic to extract resources, rather than trade route shipping, so through the Arctic. And we'll touch upon that a little more on the next slide. But with respect to UNCLOS, UNCLOS was strongly supported by a majority of the participants in this event. And UNCLOS, if the U.S. continues to not ratify it, then the U.S. could incur substantial risk in terms of economic development in the Arctic and limiting its position as a global leader on maritime issues. Also worth to point out was there was an alternative opinion, a minority opinion, that suggested that U.S. capabilities, both in terms of political leverage and military leverage, was sufficient to secure our interest in the Arctic. But again, that was a minority report. So in terms of the impact on the Arctic, today the Arctic isn't necessarily economically viable, mostly due to harsh weather conditions, lack of demand, and really insufficient technology. But as we're beginning to see, if climate change and glaciers continue to melt along its projected trend line, it makes the Arctic much more economically viable. And really targeting on the oil and gas reserves, but also, like we've heard, minerals and fisheries, particularly the demand for seaborne protein and minerals. As the world's population swells from 6 billion to 8 billion, there'll be a greater demand on energy, and of which 80% could be fossil fuels by the year 2035. And really understanding the extent of climate change and the scope of available resources is really key to determining the economic viability of the Arctic. And the capabilities we need to understand this really reside within this concept of Arctic domain awareness, which is simply a military term for understanding the complete Arctic ecosystem in terms of the many environmental factors, human factors, political factors, et cetera. And lastly, the greater the economic viability of the Arctic, what we found was the greater the need for partnerships, as she mentioned, and the greater the need to ratify UNCLOS and develop regional infrastructure to support operations up there. And we'll speak on that a little bit more on the next slide. So with respect to UNCLOS, first, without ratification of UNCLOS, the U.S. simply doesn't have a seat at the table. They don't have a say. And UNCLOS was originally drafted with U.S. interests in mind, But now that other states have ratified it and continue to modify it, whereas the U.S. continues to sit out. And if the U.S. ratifies it after modification, then it must be accepted as is, with amendments that may not have U.S. interests in mind. And another piece that's critical was ratification of UNCLOS provides the U.S. the ability, like Larry mentioned, to extend its continental shelf claim beyond its existing 200 nautical mile EEZ in order to extract resources. And the other key component also that we found was, or another risk of not ratifying UNCLOS, involves a potential impact on other interests in other regions in the world. And other states may disregard key aspects of freedom of navigation or rights under the EEZ. That's if, particularly it was the perception that other states may say, you know, if the U.S. doesn't recognize these rules, really, why should we? And the effects of nations either withdrawing from the convention or challenging it could extend in various regions around the world. One particular that was noted was the South China Sea, which is an obvious issue to U.S. national security policy. And lastly, the leadership piece, and that's UNCLOS is just another venue that is that the U.S. could leverage to continue to demonstrate its ability to lead on global maritime issues. So that first event covers the strategic level implications. In 2011, the same CNO at the time, Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Roughead, knowing that, wanted to examine, okay, if something happens in the Arctic, are we prepared to operate? Or are we prepared to sustain operations up there? And basically what we found was the Navy in particular and the Coast Guard are inadequately prepared to conduct sustained maritime operations in the Arctic. And we define sustained maritime operations as 90 days or more. So in particular, what he wanted to find was to identify those specific gaps that limit the U.S. Navy from sustaining maritime operations. And we wanted to understand, one, what were those short-term solutions that could, in the near term, close those gaps, but what are those long-term solutions that we need to prepare for beyond 10 years? And when we brought in about 75 participants and we put them through about 8 to 10 different scenarios, and these scenarios were designed to progressively get much more challenging over the course of gameplay, so over the course of the 3-4 days. And they ranged from maritime domain awareness missions to search and rescue missions, HADR, repositioning of forces through the Northwest Passage, through the Arctic. And we had 2 cells, an East Coast cell and a West Coast cell, so they both had access from the Atlantic and the Pacific. And the folks we brought in were mostly military operators and cold weather system experts, so we really were focusing at the operational level. And there were 2013 scenarios as well. So what we found was what makes it operating in the Arctic risky. And this finding here is fairly intuitive in that what we found was that as weather and climate conditions intensified, so as particularly the presence of ice, strong winds, fog, as that increased over time, and as the total time and distance traveled during an operation increased, the greater the risk to mission failure and the greater the risk of harm to friendly forces, greater the harm to our people. And so over time, the participants over time began to realize that. And so as risk to mission and risk to friendly forces increased, the more participants began to realize that we don't really have the information or capabilities we need within the U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard, and DoD at large, the Department of Defense at large. So what they began to do was tap into resources from industry and our international partners, particularly Norway and Russia were key contributors to that. We didn't have international partners here at this particular game, but it was assumed based off of pretty much status quo international agreements. And that helped us identify some of those areas where we need to further cooperate with, particularly Norway and Russia. And we'll hit on that here in the next slide. So where is the priority? Where do we need to focus our efforts as a nation? The concept of sustainability continue to emerge in terms of what are those conditions that allow U.S. forces to sustain operations in the Arctic. And the concept of reliability continued to emerge in terms of the players relying on three really big pieces, big components. The first of which was information. And again, in terms of planning, they were looking for environmental data, so anything related to the climate, weather conditions, what types of conditions that they would likely encounter while operating up in the Arctic. And then in terms of wildlife, that was another big piece that also came up in terms of ROE, believe it or not, rules of engagement for polar bears. And polar bears obviously are top of the food chain and a very interesting and important part of the Arctic. And that was something that was fairly insightful and interesting. So, and then the last piece there is information related to specific capabilities or specific platforms and systems that are available both within the U.S. and by our international partners. And those capabilities really, like we mentioned, is the lack of infrastructure to support logistics up there. So operating over 90 days, the logistics infrastructure is not there. The satellite communications, like she mentioned, is just not there. We don't operate up there. We rely, the U.S. in particular, relies very much on GPS to facilitate its communications and the lack of infrastructure there. And then lastly is really ice hardening as a subset of our existing platforms or developing new platforms that can actually operate up there. And the need to acquire additional icebreakers was a key component that the U.S. lacks. And obviously training and education in terms of we just don't operate up there right now. So we don't have a cadre of folks that are trained up to do Arctic maritime operations. And lastly, the bridge between information and capabilities is relationships. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, leveraging both domestic and international relationships with a focus on our international partners there. In the near term, this is probably the most near-term item that should be at the top of the list in terms of expanding cooperative partnerships with Canada, Russia in particular. So, with a couple minutes to spare, basically, to wrap it up, a high-level overview in terms of what these two events told us, or what we found was really the need to support ratification of UNCLOS and the need to focus on missions that enhance cooperation with our international partners focused on information sharing and search and rescue operations. And then the other piece is really to improve interoperability and the integration of our capabilities between the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard. And again, as I mentioned, expanding those partnerships beyond the U.S. government to include industry and our international partners. And lastly, acquiring additional ice-breaking capability and improving our logistics and communications infrastructure up in the Arctic. So in terms of the way ahead, where do we go from here as a nation? This administration has paid particular attention to or has initiated some new energy policies. But I think it's worth, the NSPD 66 was drafted and released 8 days prior to President Bush leaving office. So I think right now it's worth this administration paying it a closer look and refining that according to existing policies and the geopolitical environment. And next, really from that, to operationalize the strategy or the policy is to develop a whole-of-government strategy with respect to the Arctic. And then at the defense level, at the Secretary of Defense level, is to develop an Arctic strategy to help integrate our capabilities so that we can identify those missions and address and encounter those missions successfully. And lastly, really the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard are two of the primary stakeholders involved there, and it's to integrate those capabilities as well to help prepare for both in terms of funding but also in terms of planning. And that'll do it.
So while Susan is setting up the slides, I would like to thank everybody who's gone before me, my panel especially, in laying a lot of the groundwork. But again, Dr. Curry, for your excellent introduction. And I should say a disclaimer that my remarks are made purely in my personal capacity and in no way represent the views of the US government. And I also want to say hi to all the Vermont Law School students listening in on the webinar. We've got a big ocean and coastal law group up there tuned in today, and our newly formed Vermont Law School Arctic group under the Environmental Law Society. So hi, guys. So we've seen that global change has affected the Arctic Ocean in many ways, including focusing the world's attention, as Kirsten pointed out, from many different interest groups. So my talk today is in the end about how we balance those interest groups, who sets the rules and priorities in the Arctic, who shapes them. And I will use offshore oil and gas as a mini case study, but I will actually spend more of my time talking about the Arctic Council today. The Arctic Ocean, as we've heard, and its diminishing sea ice are central to the livelihoods and cultures of the Arctic's indigenous residents, who have not yet gotten much attention in the talk, so I want to spend a little time on that too. And they also support, both the ocean and the ice, an intricate web of marine life in and beyond the region. The resiliency of that web is being tested as we've seen all of the increase in vessel traffic, industrial activity, ocean acidification, and other changes. And it is a remarkable ocean. I don't know much about it, but the more I learn, we've already heard from Larry that it's some 52% of the ocean itself is continental shelf. And in fact, the Arctic Ocean continental shelf is some 25% of all the continental shelf globally, which is a pretty astonishing figure, geologic shelf. It's 1% in volume of all the world's oceans, 3% in area. And one of the critical roles it plays are estimates that it absorbs from 5 to 14% of all of the CO2 that the world's oceans take up, according to one of Kate Moran's studies. All of my co-panelists have mentioned the Law of the Sea Convention. Each of the 5 coastal Arctic states affirms the Law of the Sea and/or the Law of the Sea Convention in its respective national policies on the Arctic, so really reiterates that that is the core for any governance system, including the NSPD, the National Arctic Policy that Walter showed at one of his last slides that makes very specific reference to Law of the Sea. So here you have the International Bathymetric Chart of the Arctic Ocean, and I would also point out that on this side, remember all those buoys in the very first set of slides we had from Dr. Curry? If you looked really closely, you didn't see very many buoys on that side of the Arctic Ocean, and that poses another problem for tracking and understanding global change. So how the regional regime for the marine Arctic will develop depends on balancing the interests. We have regional regimes in other parts of the world because when I say regional regime, I mean under the Law of the Sea Convention. They're Mediterranean, Caribbean, they've had more time to develop. It's just beginning to develop. And how we balance the interests of the groups that Kirsten referred to, the 8 Arctic states, which you see listed here, whether they are the coastal states, the A5, or all 8 of the Arctic states, the A8. And what about the interests of the indigenous populations? This particular set of figures shows a population in the Arctic of about 4.5 million people. And you can see that in almost all of the Arctic nations, indigenous populations are in the minority. In Greenland, it's about 83% of the population is Inuit. In Canada, above the Arctic Circle, about half of the population is Inuit or other indigenous peoples. And just want to remind us that they were there first, and they should have a say in what goes on, and each of the nation states takes a differing approach to involving them. One thing that hasn't been said today, and I will not go into any more detail on it, but there are many, many different definitions of the Arctic, and indeed of the marine Arctic. Some depend on tree line, some depend on the Arctic Circle. It sort of depends on the purpose. So I'd be glad to answer more questions about that, but you will see varying definitions. And what's not shown here, of course, are the non-Arctic states and their interests. So given the various actors with interest in the region, it's important to start with the fact that the nation states and the Law of the Sea Convention provide a pretty solid foundation. States, after all, have jurisdiction over industrial activity in their, on their continental shelves, and the Law of the Sea Convention is recognized by all of them. But I want to also spend some time talking about the gaps that are left when you rely only on the states and only on the Law of the Sea Convention. I think we have a good sense of who the A5 and the A8 are, but I'll talk a little bit about them so to look at the gaps and the strengths of that solid foundation. I'll talk about whether the Arctic Council, as structured and as currently proposed to be reformed, is providing adequate participation for all of those with interests. I'll talk about the set of international instruments relevant to offshore oil and gas and whether those are adequate for the potentially increased activity there. And I'll say a few words at the end about domestic laws and regulations and how we might harmonize those, picking up on the theme that all three of my co-panelists mentioned of cooperation, not competition, not conflict in the Arctic. And I have time to do a little more than kind of dip into each of these. Arctic Council. So all 8 Arctic states there on the right of the slide are member, and there are 6 permanent participants, and those represent different indigenous groups. The white quotation at the bottom is from the document that established the Arctic Council in '96 as a high-level forum, not as an international organization, not with legal personality, basically to promote cooperation and involve the Arctic indigenous communities in those discussions. And security matters are specifically excluded from its mandate. If you look at the list of indigenous participants, and if you read anything about the Russian news, you might have seen that yesterday the Russian Federation closed the offices of RAPON, the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, as being in violation of its national laws on NGO operations. So that's a pretty interesting development on the side. But if you look at that list on the right, Finland, Iceland, and Sweden are not Arctic Ocean coastal states. Iceland is considered an Arctic coastal state, but not an Arctic Ocean coastal state. And the A5 and the A8 are sometimes at odds, maybe on who should have more of a say over fisheries, and sometimes they work together. And in the Arctic Council, they worked together, and the divide didn't really appear until the ice started going away. So in 2007, you may recall, the Russians planted a titanium flag at the North Pole, which was a pretty cool scientific achievement, or technical achievement. That same year was the dramatic sea ice minimum that we've seen on all of the charts, now eclipsed by the 2012 sea ice minimum. And that spring, all of the Arctic 5 coastal states got together in Ullbaek, Greenland, and they made a declaration saying, we've got it under control. You know, Europe was knocking at the door. The Arctic 3 were sort of wondering, and they said, great, Law of the Sea Convention takes care of it, or the Law of the Sea, they don't say the convention specifically. No need for an Antarctic treaty type system. There are sovereign rights up here, there are residents, so we'll use the Law of the Sea as the basis for everything. The A3 grew indignant, saying they had been excluded. Secretary Clinton at the next meeting of the A5 chided the A5 for excluding the 3. But one thing they overlook is that at the end of that declaration made in Ullbaek, Greenland, there's specific reference to the A5 will continue to work closely with the Arctic Council. So I think they both have fairly common visions, and I think we need to help them articulate those to the extent it reaches a problematic level of disagreement, which I don't think it has. So how does the Arctic, how's it structured beyond states and permanent participants? Well, states have a vote. Permanent participants are always at the table, although they don't have a vote. And then you have non-state observers. Intergovernmental organizations like the UN Environment Program or the UN Development Program, the North Atlantic Marine Mammal Commission, all have observers there. NGOs like WWF, like the Reindeer Herders Association, which I didn't know existed until I started doing work in the Arctic, circumpolar health groups. But there are others who want to join as observers. There are also states who are observers, and the current observers who, for no particular rhyme or reason, threw their hat in the ring at the appropriate time, have that status, and they can attend all meetings and working groups. And the list on the right of the states that are now interested repeats some of the names that Kirsten put up there: the EU, Italy, South Korea, China, interested in obtaining observer status. So the Arctic Council has recognized it needs to reform how it thinks about observers, and those reforms should be finalized at the 2013 meeting of the ministers in Kiruna coming up. And the whole need for reforming the Arctic Council is also in response to climate change, really. As more people want access, it needs to become something more than what has been an effective discussion group and an incredibly effective producer of studies. I don't know how many of you have read the 2004 Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. Bob Corral and others led that, and that was really a major wake-up call, drawing the world's attention to the effects of climate change in the Arctic. They've produced the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, which was the first attempt to get a grip on how much vessel traffic is up there, how much is destinational, how much is fishing. It's a couple of studies I've had the privilege of being involved in. One is we're currently working on trying to come up with a common understanding of safety culture for offshore oil and gas operations, drawing on regulators from around the north. The Council has put together guidelines. None of this is binding. Guidelines on Arctic offshore oil and gas operations. And to date, again, there's not been any ability or need to have binding regulations coming from this group that cooperates, right? Kirsten mentioned the Search and Rescue Treaty. It was signed in 2011. It was negotiated under the auspices of the Arctic Council, but it is not an Arctic Council product, if you will. The states are the ones who signed it. The permanent participants were not part of the negotiating process in the way they would have been had it been held purely under Arctic Council rules. They were generally there as members of delegations. But we now have a binding agreement among all 8 Arctic states on the need to cooperate on search and rescue. The first binding agreement between all 8 Arctic states was the Polar Bear Treaty from a couple decades before, and a very successful management regime. The third agreement between all Arctic states we anticipate will be signed in 2013 at the ministerial, following the same negotiating process of the Arctic Council being sort of the forum, but the states being the ones who produce the document, and this will be on emergency preparedness and response for marine oil spills, not prevention, preparedness and response. So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of the kinds of work the Council is doing. So we'll move on to international instruments for offshore oil and gas and whether those are adequate. The picture you see here is one that might be the image that most folks have when they think of the North, but this is also the Arctic. This is the port of Murmansk in the Russian Federation. And we will see an increasing industrialization if the economics of Arctic oil and gas ever take off. They're still sort of stalled. I can go into more detail in question and answer. This is a map of the Beaufort Sea lease regions. You see where Shell was drilling this summer, its lease blocks. The Beaufort is above Canada and the eastern US Arctic. The Chukchi is the other area where Shell was drilling this summer. And I think they had a drill bit down for 18 hours before a big old ice flow came their way. And they had to stop operations. So that just, I think, drives home some of the information we've heard about the unpredictability of conditions in the Arctic. This is just one last map to give you a sense of industrial activity right now. The green are the settlement regions, and the red are extraction fields and pipelines. They're a little bit hard to see. This map predates Shell's drilling, and I don't think it shows some of the activity for oil and gas off of Norway, but it gives you a rough idea of the still relatively limited industrial activity in the north. Focusing in on offshore oil and gas, there are 2 main gaps in international law, and this really does feel like a far cry from a lot of what we've been talking about today. But there is not a treaty on authorizing and monitoring offshore exploration and exploitation. And there's a good reason for that. That activity is handled by the states. So do we trust the states to do it right? One of the things that we're working on in the non-binding Arctic Council Forum is to come up with common standards, common best practices for offshore safety. Another problem we have is downstream. There is not a treaty, and there is not likely ever to be a treaty on responsibility and liability for industrial offshore oil and gas activity. And here I just want to make the distinction between marine activity related to offshore oil and gas and industrial activity. So the industrial is once the MODU is in place and you're beginning to drill, or you're producing, as opposed to the maritime transport, which is covered pretty well by the International Maritime Organization. But there isn't really a home for agreements that deal with the industrial activity in the offshore. It's marine, but it's industrial. And so trying to figure out how to fill those gaps occupies some of my time. The Deepwater Horizon National Commission said that the US, and I could just hear Norway laughing, should lead in the development and adoption of shared international standards for offshore oil and gas exploration. And I think that the US regulators are beginning to understand, and they've been active participants in our discussions with the Arctic Council, that they have a lot to learn, especially from Norway. Magne Ognedal from the Petroleum Safety Authority has been very generous with his time telling us what has and hasn't worked in the Norwegian system. But this report did have the effect of, I think, galvanizing interest in saying, yes, we can do it better, and the Arctic might be a really good case study for doing it better. This is a translation problem between Mac. How am I doing? Am I done? I'm close. Okay. So this is actually rhetorically maybe good that it's confused like this. But if up at the start, potentially relevant international norms and guidelines, up at the very top is International Maritime Organization. We have pretty good rules on pollution from vessels, but again, not from fixed industrial operations. We also have non-binding rules. So the 2009 Polar Code, sort of ice-strengthened vessel recommendations, is being slowly transformed into what we think will be a binding agreement someday. So the IMO also has had a very interesting discussion, even trying to decide, do we go beyond our traditional mandate? Do we change our strategic direction that says we don't move beyond sort of vessel-sourced pollution? And there have been several years of discussion in the legal committee. And they decided not to amend that strategic direction, but they did say we would at least work with countries interested in addressing liability issues on a regional basis. So it's not exactly dead, but we're not exactly sure where that idea of non-vessel type activity will go under the IMO auspices. Since I'm almost done, I will just sort of, or my time is almost done, I will just draw your attention. We've already heard from Kirsten about the Russia-Norway agreement on both fisheries and hydrocarbons. I would point out that the US and Mexico have signed a similar agreement for hydrocarbons in the Gulf of Mexico. Arctic Council, as we've already said, is moving from its reports and guidelines. It's taking a new role. There are the two treaties I mentioned as sort of a sponsor for binding agreements. And I'll just mention the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's not a binding instrument, but it does draw very clearly on the notion that Indigenous peoples have a right to participate in a meaningful way in decisions about natural resources that affect their own resources, and would be glad to discuss that in any more detail. I will not have you read this, but one of the provisions in the Law of the Sea Convention talks about harmonization, that states shall endeavor to harmonize their policies with respect to pollution from industrial activity. So there is basis in the Law of the Sea Convention. I've covered very briefly the first 2 points. I think in the interests of time, I will stop and be glad to answer questions about domestic laws and regulations, but would just say that by harmonization, I don't mean having identical rules, but at least getting the regulators to talk across borders about what are best practices. And as we speak, literally, the National Energy Board of Canada and BOEM and Betsy are co-sponsoring the third biannual Northern Oil and Gas Research Forum, which is for regulators and mostly scientists to talk about what are our research needs and how can we improve the regulatory system for offshore oil and gas. And on cooperation and not conflict, this is one of my favorite pictures from my time in the North, and that is the Louis S. Saint Laurent, the Canadian icebreaker, breaking ice for which is kind of a reversal of roles, but breaking ice for the Healy. And every opportunity I get, I say, think cooperation, don't think conflict in the North. Thank you.
We have time for some question and answer, which stands between us and receptions or dinners or wherever you might be going. So I'll turn it over to Professor Berger, and Julia and I will man the microphones and the webinar questions as well.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to all of our panelists. I'm gonna exercise my moderator's prerogative and ask the first question here. So if you just tuned in, but first I want to say, if you just tuned in this summer to Ice Road Truckers or the Deadliest Catch, or to the front page news about Greenland breaking apart and the 6 or 7 lawsuits that were filed over Shell's drilling off the North Slope of Alaska, you might have been a little bit surprised to find that these activities in the Arctic and the impacts of climate change in the Arctic have actually been going on for quite some time. And we are fortunate to have both a tremendous scope and tremendous depth of knowledge kind of here with us to explore a little bit. Betsy, I know you didn't really get a chance to address the domestic law aspect. Over the course of the speeches, we heard a lot about how changing conditions in the Arctic Ocean are affecting everything from geology to marine transport to national security to international agreements and international cooperation through the Arctic Council. A big controversy is around domestic oil and gas exploration. And so I guess I'd ask you in particular, what are the gaps in domestic law in regards to oil and gas development and other natural resource exploration in the Arctic that you think need to be filled?
I think Larry has some thoughts on that too.
Okay.
But, is this on? Do I need to push? Yes. My disclaimer is that I teach international law. I don't teach domestic law, but on this particular topic, I'm learning more and more. I think the biggest question right now within U.S. domestic law is the use of our NEPA and exclusions from that, I mean, as we saw in the Deepwater, but also regulations under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, and the need to move from prescriptive-based to performance-based standards. Canada has done the same thing. Thinking about the role of industry standards as we go to a more performance-based model, which is to not regulate every jot and tittle of the law, but say our desired outcome is 0 accidents. You, developer, tell us how you get there. And obviously it can't be entirely performance-based, but our new regulations post-Deepwater, although they were in the works before Deepwater, on safety and environmental management systems, are really attempting to make that move. But in talking to the regulators in these Arctic Council forums, we don't really have experience in how to do that in an offshore setting. And how do we appropriately learn from industry? So the new Center for Offshore Safety is not as independent of the American Petroleum Institute as the Deepwater Commission would like, but that's how it's structured. And they're beginning to pull in some good people into Betsy with more international experience in Norway, elsewhere, to think about how models from other countries might play a role, and that's encouraging to me.
Great. Larry, did you want to respond as well?
Betsy's right on the mark. I think the fundamental problem is prescriptive versus performance-based, but I've always said, added to that, in our case, at least historically, the interns have been writing the prescriptions, or maybe even first-year medical students, because we have a system whereby our regulators, our government employees, paid at government wages, where deep-sea drilling technology is so complex that people who really are expert at it are working for the industry. And so when you have a prescriptive regulatory system where you're specifying what nut and bolt to use and what sort of riser to use, and the people writing those descriptions aren't really at the top of the technology. It's a situation destined for trouble, and that's indeed what happened at Deepwater Horizon.
Great. Well, thank you both. So, questions?
Dennis Nixon, University of Rhode Island. Betsy, I want to thank you for your emphasis on indigenous peoples. It was beginning to sound like the Berlin Conference in 1880, dividing up Africa. Powers did. My question actually is both to Betsy, to you, and to Larry. Larry's been doing all this great work, freezing his butt off in the Arctic for all these years, developing the facts to enable the United States to make the case for extended jurisdiction. My question, Betsy, now you're a temporary Washington insider, as I understand it, in your current position. Is there any chance in this lame duck session of Congress, before Senator Kerry gets appointed Secretary of Defense, that he be able to convince Senator Reid to give him the floor time to push the Law of the Sea Treaty through for ratification?
2 words, Caitlin Antrim. For those of you who don't know her daily email feed, you can get more than enough detail on the prospects. But Kerry did announce that he was hoping to get this through in the lame duck session. I haven't heard any statement after the elections as to its viability, but I also know that a group of senators, after he made that announcement, Larry could speak to this too again, said, not over our dead bodies. So.
Yeah. And the sad part of this is that the new Senate, despite the fact that there are 3 more Democratic senators, they're replacing Republican senators who each have been backers of the Law of the Sea Treaty. And so in a sense, it makes it a weaker situation because it makes it more partisan. When Senator Lugar, a powerful Republican, spoke so strongly for it, it has a different resonance.
We actually have a question from the webinar, and this is for Professor Baker from your students at Vermont Law School. You called them out, so here they are for you. Does the state of Alaska have laws in place protecting the Arctic indigenous peoples' rights to have input on the use of the state's Arctic areas?
I'm less familiar with the state's laws, but our federal laws do have some minimal protections, and it's based on the responsibility of government agencies to consult effectively with Alaska Natives and with Native Americans on their interests in resource rights. There are others in the room who can speak much more knowledgeably about the Marine Mammals Protection Act, and there are, that's not related directly to the continental shelf rights we're talking about, but certainly exceptions for their use of marine mammals as opposed to non-Alaska Natives.
Yeah, and I guess I would also just add to that though legally I'm not sure there's too much more to what you're saying, politically the indigenous peoples have been very much involved in the leasing and in oil drilling activities up there, in both through litigation and through political action. So another question. Yes.
This is for Dr. Meyer. Concerning our potential claim in the Arctic to extended jurisdiction, in our hopes that someday the Senate will actually vote on it, do you think we're going to end up making more of our claim based on the bathymetric foot of the slope plus 60 formula, or are we going to end up making more of our claim up there based on sediment thickness and that formula? And that gave me a follow-on question. It sounded like you were doing just basically bathymetric work with very little sampling, and I understood that the nature of the sediment was as important as the thickness, and I'm wondering what we're doing to capture that.
Okay, you have many questions there. I think I can tell you without question that the majority of the extended continental shelf for the U.S. will be based on sediment thickness. But to determine the sediment thickness, you need to determine the sediment thickness formula starts at the foot of the slope. So the real effort all these years has been determined at the foot of the slope. The 4 cruises with the Canadians, the part that we didn't go into detail, and Betsy alluded to it, is that Canada and U.S.'s extended continental shelves overlap tremendously. So the real answer to all that is that the real extended continental shelf is going to be a result of a negotiation between Canada and the U.S. So the sediment thickness has been determined with both nations together because it's the same sediment thickness that we'll use. And that was done over 4 years in the joint operations. But each of us independently have been determining the foot of the slope. With respect to the nature of the sediment, it's not true that the nature of the sediment is an issue. And that was actually upheld. There's nothing in the treaty that talks about that, really. They talk about natural component and natural prolongation with no definition of it. But recently there was an ITLAS decision with Myanmar and Myanmar and Bangladesh. Bangladesh used the argument that all the sediment in the Indian Ocean derives from the Himalayas through Bangladesh. And for that reason, it should be a natural prolongation of Bangladesh, and at least the ITLAS court in that case. And I think Betsy will say that that only has jurisdiction over that case, but it does set a precedent, said that the nature of the sediment is not the issue, it's the processes by which it's emplaced.
One more question. There was a hand up over here. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Aaron from Brown University, graduate student. My first question is scientific. I wonder what's the proportion of the energy that caused the Arctic sea ice melting from the ocean or atmosphere or the sunlight radiation? What's the proportion for it? And my second question, if you have more time, can you talk a little bit more about related to international law? Assuming like in next decades or so, there are more activities in Arctic region, no matter what, like shipping, oil drilling stuff. And this will speed up assuming this will speed up the ice melting, and what's the big picture of the international law setting to whether to limit the access or maybe encourage access to in the Arctic region? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood fully the first one, but it's a question of the melting of the ice is a result of, is it anthropogenic versus?
Sorry, my first question is, what's the proportion of the energy, the heat that caused the ice melting in Arctic? Where they come from? What's the proportion that they come from ocean and they come from the atmosphere?
Well,
and all they come from sunlight?
I'll turn to Bill for that, yeah. Fortunately.
I can't give you exact proportions, but it's dominantly from the atmosphere. And the reason for that is that there's a very strong density gradient in the upper Arctic oceans called the halocline. You go from very fresh water right at the ice itself, which is where the ice is forming. Within about 200 meters, you get down to Atlantic Ocean waters that have come in from the north and some Pacific waters that have come in from the Bering Strait. Those are all more typically normal marine waters, and the heat transfer across that density boundary is low compared to the warming that's happening from above in the atmosphere, okay? But I couldn't give you the exact numbers, but that's only just starting to emerge. We're only just starting to get the proper measurements of the ocean heat fluxes from below to know that.
I'm really glad Bill was here for that. For the second one, it's a really interesting question, and certainly within a U.S. perspective, from a permitting perspective, over the last couple of years, since we've started, we've had to get permits for marine mammals, for all kinds of other things. But in the last couple of years, we've been asked to talk about the impact of the ice breaking on the potential of speeding up the diminishment of the ice and the noise that the vessel makes itself in breaking ice. So people are starting to become aware of that. I suspect that the Arctic Council, they're talking about that. And the Law of the Sea Treaty in Article 121 does give special capabilities to coastal states for ice-covered waters to invoke special environmental protections. And so that's where the ability to limit or restrict passage of vessels can come to the fore. Is that? Betsy?
Yeah, but I'm not sure I heard it, or maybe I was hearing a question. So if Pat Perrano, one of my colleagues from Vermont Law School, were here, he would say, why are we drilling to produce more hydrocarbons if hydrocarbons are...
That's a different question.
That's a different question, but I just wanted at least to call out that issue as well, and I'm not sure that's what you were asking.
Let's all thank our panelists.